which knots to use for ice fishing? That's a question that we get all the time, and there's a lot of different knots at work. I tie several different knots, and there's no right or wrong, but I'm going to show you some of the knots that I like to use, when I like to use them, and why I like to use them. And so if there's one knot that I probably use the most, especially for panfish, especially for small jigs like this, is just a simple Palomar knot. The reason that the Palomar knot works so well for ice fishing is that that knot cinches up really tight, and you can move that knot so that jig hangs perfectly horizontal. I mean, you can actually change the angle of that jig by just moving the knot around. And so Palomar knot is a very effective knot, especially for tying on ice jigs. Now, how do you tie a Palomar knot? I'm just going to show you here. I'm just going to use some heavy line and just a big jig just to explain this. And so biggest thing with a Palomar knot, you basically go in through your eye, take your tag end of your line, and you go back through the eye. Just like this, okay? Now you take your, see how you've got the line there, now you tie an overhand knot. Now you see that loop there? You take your loose end, your tag end right here, and you just run it through the loop. And the big thing with a Palomar knot is you want to make sure you get it nice and wet. Just use your spit if you have to. Then you just cinch it up, and make sure you use some saliva or spit, and that knot there will hold really good. It'll cinch up tight where you can really change the angle on your jig, and that's really important for keeping these jigs horizontal. Now I'll show you a couple other knots that I like to use and when I like to use them. I would say they're more specialty knots. So you take really small jigs, say size 14, size 12 jigs, you just see how tiny that jig is there. I mean, just real tiny. You have really tiny eyes, okay? A lot of times it's really hard to tie a Palomar knot on these really small jigs because the eye isn't big enough to get the line through and back. And so what I like to do with these really small jigs is tie a Snell knot. And so basically how you tie a Snell knot on an ice jig, in your eye, in order to work this effectively, your eye has to be turned 90 degrees where it's perpendicular to the jig. But you basically take your line, you run it through the eye, okay, just like this, okay, you see that, then you just take a loop, just like this, almost like tying a Snell knot on a spinner on a rig. And what you do then is you just take it and you wrap it around 4 or 5 times. So you're just like that. My finger's pinching where I wrap the line around the hook. Then you just take that tag end and you go through the loop. And you just tighten everything up. Okay? You see there, that works really good for really small jigs. Now, the disadvantage of this knot is that you can't control the angle of the jig so much, but you can see there it's going to hang fairly horizontal. But on really small jigs, I find that knot is really effective and easy to tie. Very strong knot. Works really well when you start really using finesse jigs. So I'm going to show you one other knot that I use at times, and that is a loop knot. Now here's when I like to use a loop knot. A lot of times, we're fishing, say we're fishing for big crappies or big perch, and maybe we're up on a shallow weed flat, and typically targeting bigger fish or at least aggressive fish, or maybe we're using a larger size tungsten jig, maybe a big soft plastic tail. And the thing about that type of situation is you're going to encounter some pike, or encounter some bass, maybe some walleyes. You're going to encounter some bigger fish when you're fishing for panfish. And so one thing that I like to do at times is just tie a heavier fluorocarbon leader down below my setup just to make it a little bit more pike proof. Now when you use, say, an 8 or 10 pound fluorocarbon leader, that's going to kill the action on a small jig. And so one of the things that I do to combat that is I just tie these small jigs on a loop knot. That way you still get good action. It can still hang fairly horizontal, but you just don't kill the action of that jig. And tell you what, with that system right there, I mean, you can catch a bunch of incidental bass, a bunch of incidental pike, and not have to worry about losing every jig. And so how I like to tie a loop knot, basically, some people call it the old Rapala knot. If you bought a Rapala back in the day, there was instructions on how to tie this knot, because it was also a recommended knot for using on crankbaits or lures. You just tie a loop just like this, okay? And then you take your jig and you run it through the tag end. And how big to make your loop? I don't know, you don't have to make it real big, just enough to give it some action. And so here I'm going to shorten it up about right there. And then you just wrap it around the line, maybe 4 or 5 times. Then you take your tag end and you go through that loop. And again, you want to get this wet. Get some saliva or spit on it. And you just cinch it up. And so that's how you tie your basic loop knot. And so that works really good if you have to put on a little bit heavier fluorocarbon. And there's sometimes I'll use this knot even for dead sticking and stuff where it's just an off bite, and for whatever reason you can really just get a nice bounce or a nice twitch on that jig when you're dead sticking. And so I've found at times where that loop knot can be pretty deadly, kind of an overlooked knot I think at times, but definitely a knot to have in your arsenal. Now when it comes to a little bit bigger stuff, like say you're fishing for panfish with small spoons, some small glide baits, what I like to do then is just use a really small snap. And bare minimum, I like to even put a swivel or even tie onto a split ring, but I don't like to tie direct to the spoon or to the lure, because I feel like I just get a little bit better bounce, a little bit better action. But if I'm just going to use a really small snap or a quick snap, I like to use just a small swivel above the spoon. And the thing to watch for when you're fishing for bluegills and crappies, you know, some of this bigger stuff, is that sometimes they'll start coming in on the swivel. And so if that's the case, sometimes what I'll do is I'll position that swivel a little bit higher above the lure. And then if I'm walleye fishing, you know, if I'm jigging, a lot of times I'm using braided line. But then on the end of the braid, what I'm doing is I'm tying a small, tiny swivel with just a fluorocarbon leader. The length of that leader can depend on the water. If you're in really clear water, a lot of times I'll use a little bit longer leader. But on spoons and glide baits, I like to use just a small crankbait snap. I've found that it doesn't interfere with the fish. And again, you just get a little bit better bounce, a little bit better action when you're tying direct. And obviously you can change lures a lot easier. And so that's kind of the system. You know, again, on these lines here, all Palomar knots just because they're strong and they're easy to tie. And if I'm using live bait, like say a dead stick or dead rod, usually I'm using monofilament. But just a couple different knots, a couple different options. And I know that no matter where you're fishing, you know, one of these knots is going to suit your needs pretty well. And you know, when it comes to panfish, so Palomar knot, Snell knot, and loop knot, those 3 knots really cover a lot of the bases.